Over the last couple of weeks, probably last months actually, we looked at 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15. What an amazing chapter of how God has revealed to us how his resurrection is intricately and deeply connected to our resurrection. Boy, that was a great chapter, wasn't it? Now we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And if you look at 1 Corinthians 16, after having gone through 1 Corinthians 15, it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of like Paul's wrap-up letter, his final instructions. Okay, guys, do this, do that, do such and such. And on the surface, it seems to be simply some final instructions at the end of a letter. But if you dig deeper into the instructions Paul gives, you will discover some amazing things. We will see how better to love those around us, how to love one another better. There's a pattern there that exists in 1 Corinthians 16. So over the next few weeks, we are going to look at that pattern, to discover that pattern and learn how we can love one another better. Today, we're going to look at the first aspect, the first display of that pattern of loving others well, which comes from Paul's instructions for how they are to care for their brothers and sisters, not in Corinth, but in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem. You see, Corinth was quite a ways away from Jerusalem. If you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1, today our focus is going to be on verses 1 through 4. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Verse 1 says this, "Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye." So what's Paul talking about here? What is this collection for the saints? What's the background behind the instructions that Paul has given to the Corinthian church family that kind of ties in with the instructions that he has given to the Galatian church family and also even the church in Rome? There's a lot of background to this, so I think it's helpful for us to explain it, to see what it is, so that it helps us to understand Paul's instructions a lot better. So the people in Jerusalem church, not Corinthian church, but the Jerusalem church, have been going through intense persecution. Heavy persecution. There were many powerful people in Jerusalem and in the region of Judea who wanted to stop the message of the gospel and were willing to do anything to keep the gospel, that message, from spreading and to silence those who followed Jesus. On top of that, they were getting ready to go through a severe famine in their area. So not only are they facing persecution and finding it hard enough to survive as it is, that persecution and the difficulty of trying to survive in and of itself is compounded, made worse because of the famine. So Paul and Barnabas had begun to help prepare for their survival. And they did that. One of the ways they did that is to ask churches around them to help their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. We see this story played out in the book of Acts, chapter 11, where they discover the coming famine. Acts 11, verse 28 says this, "And there stood up one of them named Agabus." Agabus is a prophet who often comes and appears and prophesies specific things concerning their region there in Jerusalem. And Agabus stood up and said, and signified by the Spirit, that there should be great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Verse 29, "Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea." The region where Jerusalem was. And then verse 30, "which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul." So Agabus says, guys, listen, there's a famine coming, and it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. And so, because of the prophecy that Agabus had said, they had time to prepare for the coming difficulty that the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem and the area around Jerusalem, Judea, were going to have to suffer. So Paul begins by providing help. He asks the churches to start helping to provide and meet for their needs. And so churches all around that region gave to meet their needs. And there was a reason that they wanted to give. There was something they understood about the Jerusalem church and how it connected to their church. They understood what the Jerusalem church meant to them. In Romans, Paul, in his instructions, says it this way. When he sends his letter to the church in Rome, he says, Romans 15, "But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints." I'm getting ready to minister to them. "For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia," this is the region of where Corinth is, "to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things." See, Paul makes this clear understanding of what the Jerusalem church meant to all of the other churches in the region. Paul wanted them to understand how important the Jerusalem church was. These other churches recognized that they had received the amazing message of the gospel, the message of how Jesus gave them something much more valuable than anything temporary: forgiveness of sins, a relationship with the Creator of all things, literally the things we sang this morning of how good and how wonderful God is, and that wonder and that goodness and faithfulness of God is also towards me, not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles also. And for that message to reach them required sacrifice. The message of Jesus required sacrifice. One of the reasons the message of the gospel came to the churches all around the region was because of the sacrifices that the Jerusalem church made in the persecution that they endured for spreading the message of the gospel. And so, that's why they wanted to give back. It's our turn. Let's do something. Let's give back. You know, that's really interesting. There's really all kinds of ways to give to those around you. In this passage right here, Paul describes two ways. One is the sacrifice of enduring for the gospel so that spiritual giving can happen, so that the spiritual gifts may be distributed to those around us. The sacrifice of spreading the gospel is potentially one way that we can love our brothers and sisters. And there is also the message of the gift of finances. There's all kinds of ways to give to those around you. There are definitely times when the need is best cared for through financial care. This is what the Jerusalem church needed, and this is what Paul recognized, and he said, "Hey guys, this is their need. Let's meet it." But there are many other ways to give as well. Along with that, there will be times when the best way to love someone is through things that have more value than physical things. Sometimes what the person needs is your presence. Sometimes they need your encouragement. Sometimes the thing someone needs is wisdom. Sometimes the one thing that a person needs is the hope and peace that comes from knowing and trusting in what Jesus did for them. So don't assume that if you don't have anything financial to give, it is okay to ignore this part of the passage. There are all kinds of ways for us to love those around us, but the question is, how do we do that well? How do we do that well? How do we love others well? Paul, let's take a look and we'll continue to read this. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Paul tells the Corinthian church family to plan, to prepare for what they will give them. Think about your brothers and sisters in Jerusalem each week. Don't forsake them. Don't forget them throughout the time that you're preparing. Take time each week to remember them, to store for them, to lay up for them, to care for them. Let each week be a time when you remember your brothers and sisters. Don't just forget about them. And Paul's saying, don't just forget about them, and then when I come, you make this random gift. That's not what it's about. Sometimes loving your brothers and sisters means to be faithful in remembering them. Another thing is that loving others can be done not only in different ways, but also to different degrees. Did you know that there are some ways that you can love others that are better than the person sitting next to you? Some ways you can, if you don't have anybody sitting next to you, look around the room. But if there's all kinds of ways, there are ways that you can love others better than the person near you. And there are also ways that that person can love better than you can. In some ways, God prospers some people more than other people in finances. But he also prospers some people more than others in wisdom or encouragement. So if you can't love someone in one way that well, that's okay. Do the best you can. But also find out how God has prospered you. And focus on sharing that with others as best as you can. That's really important. As God has prospered. In one context, it could be financial, but in another context, it could be the gift of being able to encourage and love others in a way that goes much further than financial aspects. It could be wisdom, where God gives you wisdom to be able to walk through life and to be able to share that wisdom with those who need it in times of great difficulty and confusion. That could be an aspect of loving your brothers and sisters. So it's good to know how God has prospered you. But along with understanding what you have to give, there's also another really important part in learning how to love others. And that is learning what they need. Learning what they need. How do we do that? One part is understanding you, but the other part is understanding the person you are loving. Verse 3 and verse 4 makes a very interesting there's an interesting thing here. Paul says this to the Corinthian church family. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. Verse 4. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. Do you understand what Paul's saying here? Paul doesn't say this. Listen, guys, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And because I'm going to Jerusalem, if some of you want to go with me, come on, let's go, let's do it. That's not what Paul says. Paul says something very different. He says, you guys pick some people in your church family to take your gift to your brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. And if it works out for me to go, I'll go with you. Notice the main people going. The main people going are the people in the church family, not Paul. Paul says, if it works out for me to go, I'll go. But you guys pick some people to take your gift to the Jerusalem church. Why is that important? Why is that necessary? And why did Paul decide to do it that way? Well, there are several reasons. First, part of loving someone is to learn what their needs are. Learn what their needs are. And that means spending time with them, getting to know their situation, so that you can love them and care for them in the way that they actually need. It's so important to understand that. I remember way back, remember when 3/11 happened and the great earthquake and the tsunamis happened? Well, just a few weeks after that, a group of us decided that we would see what we could do to go help. We had no idea. A whole bunch of people in the States had sent us a bunch of money to care for the needs of the people who were devastated. But we had no idea what they needed. So what were we going to do? We decided at least to start out by getting some basic stuff at Costco and then going up to Kesenuma, which is the place that we started our base at, to be able to go help people. So when we went, our first thought is the best place to go is to take this stuff to the Hinanjo, where people are gathering, where people have needs. The Hinanjo is thank you so much. Evacuation centers. So they had evacuation centers set up all throughout the city where people could go when they had lost their homes and different things like that. So we figured, okay, that's where the need's at, that's where we'll go. So we went there and we brought these boxes of fruits and vegetables and all this boxes of food. And as we go up to the doors and they walk us around a little bit, and we're walking by stacks and stacks of boxes of food and clothes. And we're carrying our stuff, and it's like, they already have everything they need. What do we do? So we realized pretty quickly that that wasn't where the need was. So one of the basketball friends that I have, his name is Naru. His mom and dad live in Kesenuma, actually really close to the Hinanjo that we went to. So on our way home, while we're trying to figure out what in the world do we do, I called up his mom and dad, said, hey, we're really close. Can we come say hi to you and just kind of see how they're doing, and maybe if they needed a few things or whatever, we could give it to them. So we went and we talked to them, literally less than a 5-minute drive from the Hinanjo. And when we got there, one of the things that we discovered was that there were so many people who weren't directly connected to the evacuation center. Instead of going to the evacuation center to find rescue and relief, they went to their friend's house or they went to their family's houses. And so in doing that, what happened was they weren't connected directly to the Hinanjo, and so the Hinanjo had to specifically take care of people in their Hinanjo, and so that's what the food was for. So they were unable to give that to those around them who weren't directly connected and signed up. And so you have people who are living in homes of their friends and their family who have lost everything but have no way to get anything. When we found that out, we're like, oh, this is it. This is why we're here. This is what we've come to do. So Naru's dad and mom went ahead and called people in the area, and it was just insane. Within just 10, 15, 20 minutes, people started coming from out of nowhere, just flooding this area. We had 2 big trucks full of stuff. And so they would look through them, and we got like all kinds of clothes, we got food, we got all kinds of stuff. And then they would look at the things that we had, and some things they really needed, and some things they're like, that's not something we really need. And it was really helpful for us. Then we started asking people, what do you need? And it was interesting to supply things like kerosene, like diapers, toilet paper, things like a guy needed a pair of boots. One guy he was big, and so the normal clothes that people would give in donations were never big enough for him, so he needed clothes that fit him. All kinds of unique and special things that people desperately needed, that we were able to learn what they needed. Some people just wanted us to sit and listen to them. Some people just wanted a listening ear to let them just tell us what life was like then. Some people just wanted a hug. Each need was specific to each person. And by going there and seeing the need, we were able to better love them in the way that they needed. Maybe that's what Paul had in mind when he sent people from each church to take their gift to the Jerusalem church family. Acts 24, I don't have it in there. Acts 20 talks about different churches that Paul sent, all the different churches that came with Paul to love on the Jerusalem church family. That way they could see firsthand what life was like for the brothers and sisters there, and they could go back to their church family and tell them what they saw, so that each church family could more clearly know how to help and pray for their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. That's one way. That's one reason I think Paul sent those men. There's another reason. To remind the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem to know firsthand that their suffering, their labor was not in vain. Do you remember the last verse in 1 Corinthians 15? The last verse in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, says this: Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Sometimes, when you're doing something for Jesus, when you're sacrificing, or you're going through a really hard time as you serve Him, there will be times when it's easy to struggle and wonder if what you're doing, what you're going through, really has meaning, really has value. The reason we feel that way is because we can't see what God is doing through our sacrifice and struggle. We can't see it all the time. Remember what Paul said to the church family in Rome? The reason we want you to give them a gift is because you are debtors to them because of the sacrifices that they made and reaching the spiritual gift of salvation to you. Paul wanted the church family to understand that churches all over the world were the fruit of their labor and suffering. Paul wanted the Jerusalem church not just to hear about it, but to see them firsthand. Here is the fruit of your labor. Here is the fruit of your suffering. Here is the fruit of you having to go through persecution and suffering and discouragement. This is the fruit of your labor. It's worth it. How precious do you think it was to the Jerusalem church family to know that the struggles that they had been going through for years would result in so many people finding that same hope in Jesus that they had? How much more valuable do you think it was to see that than if they had just sent a gift of money and that was it? Sometimes getting to see that is what keeps us going. Sometimes getting to see the fruit of our struggles, the fruit of our labor, to know that God is really working in us, but also through us for His glory. Seeing that is worth it to keep going the next day and the next day. That is so much more precious than gold or silver. Here's the other thing too, the last reason. The last reason I think Paul sent people from other churches to the church in Jerusalem is to let them see firsthand the fruit of their love and their sacrifices for their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. Can you imagine what it was like for them to go home? Man, we gave them this gift. Man, I tell you what, they were really hurting. It was worth it for us to sacrifice week in, week out, to make sure that we were able to provide for their needs. It was worth it. Listen, they were able to buy food. They were able to take care of clothes that they needed. These are the things that they were able to do because of our sacrifice. Let's keep doing it. Let's keep going. It's worth it. There's value here. It has meaning. And in doing so, they could go home and remind their church family that their sacrifices were worth it. That it was worth it to do what they could to help their brothers. That's how they keep going. That's how we keep going. This passage has a lot to it. There's a lot here. Just in these simple instructions that Paul gives. Take time. Be prepared. Gather for the needs that you know that you're going to have come. Prepare yourselves. Plan ahead. Don't forget about them. Don't forget about your brothers and sisters that need your love, but plan for them and prepare for them. Secondly, remember that there are many ways to love your brothers and sisters. There's many ways to serve. Sometimes it can be financial. Sometimes it can be all kinds of other ways. Hope, help, encouragement. It could be the simple act of changing a tire. Who knows? But there are all kinds of ways that God has prospered you in which you can share with those around you. Secondly, not only is it important to know what you have, what God has prospered you in, it's also important to understand what their needs are. It takes time. It takes being willing to spend time with those around you to know what their needs are so that you can love them well. In all these ways. And finally, knowing that what you do to love others is not vain, it is not meaningless, it has value, it has worth there. Even when there are times when you don't get to see that, when you don't get to see the direct effect, when you don't directly get to see it, the reminder that we have in 1 Corinthians 15:58 is important for us too. It's important for us to be steadfast, be unmovable, to always be abounding in the work of the Lord. Because our labor, in the same way as their labor in the Corinthian church, and the sacrifices and struggles in the Jerusalem church, our labor is also not in vain in the Lord. So, it's worth it. It's worth taking time to know what God has prospered you with. It's worth taking time to know how you can love others better. And it's worth making the sacrifices, going through the struggles in order to love those around you. And in so doing, God displays his glory through us. What an amazing thing to think about. What an amazing thing. Let's pray. Father, we are reminded today of so many ways that you have blessed us. So many ways you have enabled us. Maybe some through finances. Maybe some through the natural ability to help and to encourage. Maybe some to the natural ability, the spiritual gift of wisdom to be able to help people walk through life. So many ways that you have prospered us. Father, help us to use these gifts of grace to love others better than we could before. Help us to take time to know what those around us need and then love them in the way that they need through how you have prospered us. Thank you for using us. Thank you for letting us be a part of displaying your goodness, your faithfulness, your mercy, your grace, and so much more. Thank you for letting us be part of displaying that. Father, in each way, help us to learn to love others just a little bit better. In Jesus' name, amen.